Dr. Marcus Evans was just doing his job until a racist cop grabbed him, demanding proof that he was a real doctor. The hospital went silent. People stared. Cameras rolled. But before things could get worse, Shaq stepped in. What happened next destroyed the officer's career, changed Marcus's life forever, and sent shockwaves across the internet. Stay till the end, because this revenge is one for the history books. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Shaq stepped out of his SUV, adjusting the sleeves of his hoodie as the crisp evening air wrapped around him. St. Mary's Hospital stood tall before him, its glass doors reflecting the city lights. He had been here plenty of times before, surprising sick kids, donating to the pediatric ward, and reminding families that they weren't alone. But tonight, something felt off. Just as he approached the entrance, he noticed tension crackling in the air. A few steps away, near the hospital's revolving doors, a heated argument was unfolding. A police officer, stocky with a square jaw and cold blue eyes, loomed over a young black man in navy blue scrubs. The officer's badge read, Sergeant Callahan, and from the way his hand hovered near his belt, he wasn't just asking questions. Shaq slowed his steps, watching. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Callahan said, his voice firm, edged with something more than authority. The young man, Dr. Marcus Evans, exhaled through his nose, keeping his posture straight. "I already showed you my hospital badge," he said, his tone professional, but frustration flickered beneath the surface. "I work here." Callahan snatched the ID from Marcus's hands and studied it, squinting. "This could be fake," he muttered. A few bystanders slowed their steps. A nurse standing near the doorway froze, gripping her clipboard. Shaq took another step forward, his towering presence unnoticed. For now. Marcus let out a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "I just finished a 14-hour shift," he said. "I don't have time for this." Callahan smirked, crossing his arms. "Yeah? And yet you've got time to hang around the front of the hospital like you own the place?" Shaq's jaw clenched. He had seen this play out before. Different places, different people, same story. Marcus shook his head, glancing toward the entrance. "Listen, if you just check with the staff," Callahan stepped into his space, the hostility sharp enough to cut glass. "I don't need to check with anyone. If you really worked here, you wouldn't be giving me attitude." Shaq had enough. He moved in closer, his shadow stretching over both men. But before he could open his mouth, Callahan grabbed Marcus's arm. "That's it," Callahan snapped. "You're coming downtown for questioning." Shaq stopped in his tracks, his fingers curled into fists. This just became a much bigger problem. The cop suddenly grabs Marcus's arm, saying, "You're coming downtown for questioning." Marcus barely had time to react before Callahan's grip tightened on his arm. "You're coming downtown for questioning." The officer's voice was sharp, edged with authority that felt more like a threat. For a split second, Marcus's mask of patience cracked. His jaw clenched, his chest rose with a deep breath. But he didn't resist. He knew how this worked. He had seen it happen before. To friends, to colleagues, to himself. But before Callahan could pull him forward, a shadow loomed over both men. A very, very large shadow. Shaq stepped in, his towering frame making Callahan look laughably small in comparison. "Let him go." His voice wasn't loud, but it rumbled, the kind of deep, weighted tone that made people listen. Callahan turned, still gripping Marcus's arm, his expression shifting to irritation. He barely glanced at Shaq, sizing him up with a dismissive sneer. "This doesn't concern you," he snapped. "Move along." Shaq didn't move. Marcus, still tense, exhaled. He recognized that voice. He had seen that face on TV, in commercials, on the court. But right now, Shaq wasn't an NBA legend. He was just a man standing between him and a bad situation getting worse. Shaq's eyes dropped to Callahan's hand, still gripping Marcus's arm. "Let him go," Callahan scoffed. "And who exactly are you supposed to be?" Shaq smirked, a slow, knowing expression. "Oh, this was going to be fun. I'm the guy who's about to make your night a whole lot worse." Callahan hesitated, just for a second, the first crack in his confidence. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Step away. This is a police matter." Marcus took the opportunity to speak. "I work here. I literally just finished a 14-hour shift." Callahan scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Yeah, and I'm the mayor. You don't look like a doctor. A few bystanders gasped. A nurse nearby instinctively took a step closer, her hands gripping the clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. Shaq's smirk vanished. His eyes darkened. "Say that again." Callahan lifted his chin. "I said, he doesn't look like a doctor." Wrong move. Shaq unfolded his arms and took a deliberate step forward, making sure Callahan had to crane his neck just to keep eye contact. "Let's see if your boss agrees." The power in the air shifted, and for the first time, Callahan looked nervous. Shaq folds his arms and says, "Let's see if your boss agrees." "Let's see if your boss agrees." Shaq's words hung in the air like a loaded threat. The energy in the hospital lobby had shifted. A few nurses had stopped what they were doing. Patients waiting nearby had turned their heads. And Callahan, his smirk had faded. Just a little, but he still wasn't letting go of Marcus. "I don't need approval to do my job," Callahan snapped, tightening his grip. "I got a suspicious person report, and Marcus?" A sharp voice cut through the tension. A nurse, middle-aged with graying curls and sharp eyes, pushed through the crowd. Her name tag read, Head Nurse Linda Pearson. She took one look at Marcus, at Callahan, at the way the officer's fingers were still clenched around Marcus's arm, and she was not having it. "What the hell is going on here?" she demanded. Marcus exhaled. "Apparently I don't look like a doctor." Pearson's expression hardened. "Oh, for God's sake." She turned on Callahan. "I've worked with Dr. Evans for 5 years. He's one of our best surgeons. Who the hell do you think you are?" A ripple of whispers moved through the hospital staff. A few more nurses stepped closer. Someone from the reception desk peeked over the counter. Callahan's confidence faltered, but only for a second. He squared his shoulders. "I received a report of a suspicious person loitering outside. I'm just doing my job." Shaq folded his arms. "Who exactly called in this suspicious person report?" The room went quiet. Callahan hesitated. For the first time, real hesitation. And that's when hospital security arrived. 2 uniformed security officers strode in, their walkie-talkies crackling as they scanned the situation. Their badges read, Saint, Mary's Medical Security, meaning they were not under Callahan's authority. One of them, a tall man with dark brown skin and a neatly trimmed beard, spoke first. "Sergeant, is there a reason you're detaining one of our doctors?" Callahan's jaw ticked. "This is a police matter," he said quickly, shifting his stance. "I have a right to question anyone who seems out of place." Pearson cut him off. "Out of place?" she echoed, stepping forward. "Would you have said that if Dr. Evans looked like you?" Boom! The weight of that question slammed into the room. Even Callahan felt it. His fingers twitched at his belt. His eyes darted to Shaq, then to Marcus, then to the hospital security. He was losing control of the situation. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice calm, but laced with something dangerous. "So, I'll ask you again. Who called in this suspicious person report?" Callahan froze, and in that split second, everyone knew. Shaq asked Callahan, "Who called in this suspicious person report?" The officer hesitates. For the first time, Callahan hesitated. Shaq's question had landed like a hammer, shaking the officer's once solid confidence. "Who called in this suspicious person report?" The officer's posture stiffened, his fingers twitching near his belt, not quite reaching for his radio, but hovering there as if he needed something to hold on to. His jaw clenched and his eyes darted toward the hospital security guards now standing at attention. The air in the lobby felt charged. Every passing second without an answer only made it worse. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He was waiting, and so was everyone else. More nurses had stopped what they were doing. A few patients in the waiting area turned in their seats, watching. The murmur of the hospital had quieted, as if the entire building had paused to see what would happen next. Marcus folded his arms, his patience wearing thin. "Well, Sergeant," Marcus said, his voice cool but edged with irritation, "you had no problem putting your hands on me a few minutes ago. Let's hear it. Who made the call?" Callahan exhaled sharply, his nostrils flaring. "I got a report from dispatch." His voice was steady, but there was something beneath it. Uncertainty. Shaq tilted his head slightly, unimpressed. "Oh, yeah." He let the words sit for a beat, then pressed. "So there's an official record?" Callahan hesitated again. It was barely a flicker, but everyone saw it. Shaq let out a short breath. "Good. Then you won't mind if security calls dispatch and confirms." The lead hospital security officer, a tall man with dark brown skin and a neatly trimmed beard, nodded immediately. He grabbed his radio. Dispatch, this is Saint. Mary's security. Can you confirm if a suspicious person report was filed for our hospital entrance tonight? Callahan's face tightened. The radio crackled, but no response came. Dead silence. A few nurses whispered to each other. Marcus glanced at Shaq, and for the first time that night, a flicker of vindication crossed his face. The truth was starting to crack. Callahan squared his shoulders, attempting to regain control. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I don't have to explain myself to you people. The way he said it, you people, made the tension in the room snap like a stretched rubber band. Shaq's expression didn't change, but his stance did. His shoulders squared slightly, his arms folding across his chest in a way that made him seem even bigger. Oh, but you do, he said, his voice low, steady, dangerous. Callahan's fingers twitched near his belt again, his breathing shallow. He glanced toward the entrance as if considering walking out, but it was too late. Shaq turned to hospital security. Call his supervisor. One of the security officers, a woman with short black hair and sharp eyes, gave a small nod and walked toward the front desk. The room buzzed with whispers. The entire hospital lobby had become a scene, and Callahan was standing in the middle of it, his control slipping away with every second. Marcus shook his head, his jaw tight. Unbelievable, he muttered. I save lives here, and I still have to prove I belong. A nurse standing nearby spoke up. We stand by you, Doctor. Evans. Another doctor, older, his hands in the pockets of his white coat, stepped closer. All of us do. Callahan's face reddened. His authority, his power, it was crumbling. Shaq took a step back, reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. With a quick tap, the camera app opened. Callahan's eyes darted to the screen. His jaw tightened. What the hell are you doing? Shaq's expression didn't change. This is going online. And just like that, everything shifted. Shaq pulls out his phone and starts recording, telling Callahan, this is going online. For the first time that night, Callahan looked rattled. His breathing had changed, shallower, uneven. His authority, once unshakable, was slipping right through his fingers. And now, with Shaq's phone recording, the walls were closing in fast. The tension was thick enough to suffocate. The crowd of nurses, doctors, and hospital staff had grown, all of them watching the scene unfold. A few whispered to each other. Others simply stared, waiting to see how this would end. And then, the sound of police radio chatter crackled from the entrance. A second officer stepped inside. He was younger than Callahan, taller but leaner, with hazel eyes that immediately flickered with unease as he took in the situation. His name tag read, Briggs. And in an instant, Shaq knew this guy was different. Briggs scanned the room, his gaze landing on Callahan's tense posture, Marcus's clenched jaw, and Shaq, towering, recording, unbothered. He had walked into a disaster. Briggs cleared his throat. What's going on here? Callahan straightened, regaining some of his composure. Just handling a situation, Callahan said quickly, waving a dismissive hand. Nothing serious. Shaq let out a low, amused chuckle. Yeah, he said, lowering his phone slightly but keeping it recording. You sure about that? Briggs narrowed his eyes. He wasn't stupid. He could feel the energy in the room. Something wasn't right. Marcus took a sharp breath, his patience finally snapping. Your guy here tried to arrest me, Marcus said, his voice sharp. I work here, I'm a doctor. Briggs's brows shot up. What? Callahan glared at Marcus. I was investigating a suspicious person. Shaq's smile didn't fade, but his voice dropped into something colder. Suspicious? He gestured around the hospital. You mean the doctor? At the hospital? Where he works? Briggs looked back at Callahan, his face unreadable. But something had changed. His shoulders tensed, his fingers twitched near his radio. He already knew. This was bad. The lobby had gone completely silent. Callahan shifted uncomfortably. He was losing his grip, and Briggs was catching on. Shaq, sensing it, took a step closer and spoke just loud enough for the whole room to hear. So tell me, Officer Briggs, he said smoothly, is this what you guys do? Harass doctors while they're trying to save lives? Briggs opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned back to Callahan, his voice low. Man, he whispered, we have a problem. And just like that, Callahan finally looked scared. Briggs whispers to Callahan, man, we have a problem. Callahan's face lost all color. Briggs's whisper had hit like a gunshot. Man, we have a problem. The younger officer's voice was low, urgent, deadly serious. Callahan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his belt. He knew what was coming. The problem wasn't just the growing crowd. It wasn't just Shaq standing there, recording every second of this mess. The problem was who else was watching. Briggs stepped closer, lowering his voice so only Callahan could hear. "The chief knows." Callahan flinched. A tiny movement, but Shaq caught it. His whole demeanor shifted, shoulders locking up, jaw tightening. For the first time, he wasn't just angry. He was scared. But before he could respond, the hospital director stormed in, a tall man in his 60s with silver hair and piercing gray eyes. He moved through the crowd like a storm gathering strength. His tailored suit screamed authority, but it was his expression, a mix of cold fury and disbelief, that made people step aside. The name tag on his blazer read, Dr. Howard Kingston, Chief of Medicine. He stopped in front of Callahan, barely sparing him a glance before turning to Marcus. "Dr. Evans, are you all right?" Kingston's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. Marcus straightened, nodding. "I'm fine. But this," he gestured toward Callahan. "This was unacceptable." Kingston's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze, icy, unforgiving, directly on Callahan. "You harassed my staff?" His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of authority that couldn't be ignored. Callahan opened his mouth. No words came out. Briggs sighed, shaking his head. "Sergeant, I suggest you say something, because this is bad." Callahan's hands balled into fists at his sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had been in control. He had been the one making the accusations. But now, the tables had turned so fast he could barely keep up. Shaq, standing a few feet away, still holding his phone up, let out a low chuckle. "Didn't think this one through, did you?" Callahan's skin burned with humiliation. And then, Shaq's phone buzzed. He glanced down. A name flashed across the screen. A well-known journalist. Calling him directly. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Oh, this was about to get even worse. Shaq gets a call from a journalist. Callahan's nightmare had just begun. Outside the hospital, the first wave of reporters was already arriving, their vans pulling up to the curb like sharks sensing blood in the water. Cameras were rolling, microphones were ready, and the growing crowd of hospital staff inside watched as the world came knocking. Callahan's pulse thundered in his ears. He turned sharply towards Shaq, eyes wide with panic. "You need to delete that video, right now." Shaq barely moved. His 7 feet 1 inch frame loomed over Callahan like an unshakable wall. He blinked once, then let out a low, amused chuckle. "Delete it." His voice was calm. Too calm. "Now why would I do that?" Callahan gritted his teeth. The situation was slipping faster than he could control. "Because this isn't what it looks like. You're making this worse." Shaq tilted his head as if considering it. Then he let out another slow chuckle. "Nah, you did that all on your own." Before Callahan could argue, the hospital doors swung open, and the cold night air swept inside. Bright floodlights from the news vans cast long shadows across the polished floors. Reporters rushed forward, their voices overlapping. "Shaq, can you comment on what happened tonight?" "Dr. Evans, were you really detained while working here?" "Sergeant Callahan, do you have anything to say about these accusations?" Callahan froze. He turned to Briggs, his face pale. "Get them out of here." Briggs exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "You think I can stop this? This thing's already viral?" Callahan's stomach dropped. "Viral?" He spun back to Shaq. "You didn't." His voice cracked. Shaq smirked, holding up his phone. The screen was still recording. Live. Callahan staggered back, his breath catching. "You?" he started, his voice failing him. Shaq slid the phone into his pocket. "Yeah, I did." The reality of it all came crashing down. This wasn't just some isolated incident. This wasn't going away quietly. Callahan's name was already plastered across social media. Hashtags were trending. His face was probably on a dozen Twitter threads by now. And it wasn't stopping. The career he spent years building was now hanging by a thread. Callahan turned back to Shaq, his desperation leaking through. "Listen, man," he started, trying to lower his voice. "You don't understand what's at stake here. We can fix this. Just delete the video, and we'll—" Shaq's smirk vanished. "We?" He leaned in slightly, voice low but heavy. "There is no we." Callahan swallowed hard. His hands were shaking now. Marcus stepped forward, still calm, but his words carried weight. I don't want revenge. I just want justice. Shaq studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Oh, you're getting justice. His eyes flickered back to Callahan. Watch this. And with that, Shaq stepped forward, heading straight for the cameras. Callahan? He could only stand there, watching as his world collapsed around him. Shaq smirks and says, Oh, you're getting justice. Watch this. The police cruiser pulled up fast, tires screeching slightly as it came to a stop in front of the hospital. The back door swung open, and Chief Reynolds stepped out. He wasn't just here to observe. He was here to clean up a mess. His tall frame moved with purpose, his navy blue uniform crisp and commanding, but his face? Pure fury, the kind that made officers straighten up before he even spoke. Inside, Callahan saw him coming and went pale. Shaq stood near the entrance, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold like a man who already knew the ending. The moment Reynolds stepped inside, the hospital lobby, already tense, fell completely silent. His eyes locked onto Callahan, then flicked toward Briggs. Tell me this isn't as bad as I think it is, Reynolds said, his voice low but cutting. Briggs looked away. He had no defense. Callahan rushed forward, forcing a stiff smile. Chief, listen. This whole thing is just a... Shaq moved first. With one smooth motion, he pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it around. The video played, clear as day. Reynolds watched. The entire room did. Callahan visibly shrank. Shaq didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The footage did all the talking. Callahan grabbing Marcus. Callahan refusing to listen. Callahan insisting a black doctor didn't belong at the hospital he worked at. Reynolds exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple like a man who'd just been handed the worst news of his career. Then, without hesitation, he turned to Callahan. Hand over your badge and gun. Callahan froze. The blood drained from his face. Sir, wait, he started, but Reynolds wasn't interested. Now. Callahan looked around, searching for an ally, but there were none. Briggs, silent. The hospital staff, staring. Shaq, waiting. Marcus, arms crossed, watching it all unfold. Callahan's fingers twitched at his belt. Slowly, he unhooked his badge, his grip on it tightening. But when it came to his gun, he didn't move. His breathing grew shallow. His eyes flickered toward Shaq, then Marcus. And then, he made his final mistake. He shook his head. Number, you don't understand what really happened. This is all being twisted. I was just doing my job. Shaq tilted his head, smirking. That's funny, he said, pulling up another video. Callahan's face crumpled. Because Shaq? He had more proof. Callahan refuses and tries to spin the story, but Shaq has more proof. For a moment, Callahan stood frozen, gripping his badge like it was the last thing tethering him to power. His mind raced, searching for a way out. An excuse. Anything. But before he could open his mouth, a voice cut through the silence. This wasn't random. The words came from the back of the crowd. A nurse, mid-40s, with tired eyes and a firm stance, stepped forward. Her ID badge read, Nancy Whitaker, RN. Callahan's face darkened the second he saw her. Nancy folded her arms. You want to tell them? Or should I? Callahan's jaw clenched. Nancy didn't wait for an answer. She turned to the chief, her voice clear, unwavering. This isn't the first time Sergeant Callahan has crossed paths with Dr. Evans. A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Marcus stiffened. Even he didn't know what was coming next. The chief's eyes narrowed. Explain. Nancy nodded, glancing at Marcus. 2 years ago, Dr. Evans treated Callahan's nephew in the ER. Marcus's brows furrowed. Wait, what? Nancy continued. The boy had a serious asthma attack. Dr. Evans stabilized him. Saved his life, actually. Marcus' expression softened for a second. He remembered now. The kid had been barely 7 years old, gasping for air, his tiny hands clawing at his chest. Marcus had worked fast, securing his airway, making sure he pulled through. But Nancy wasn't finished. She turned to Callahan, her eyes sharp. And while Marcus was doing his job, you were screaming at a black nurse for touching your family instead of letting them work. Callahan's face turned scarlet. A wave of murmurs spread through the crowd. Nancy shook her head. Marcus called you out that night, told you to back off, told you your nephew needed medical attention, not your attitude. And you hated that, didn't you? Marcus exhaled, a mix of shock and disgust settling in. So that's what this was about? Callahan's nostrils flared. You don't know what you're talking about. But now everyone did. This wasn't just profiling. This was payback. The chief took a slow step toward Callahan. His face was unreadable, but his next words landed like a hammer. You're done! Callahan's entire world collapsed. The chief turns to Callahan and says, You're done. Callahan stood motionless, his face drained of all color. The chief's words echoed in his ears, ringing louder than the crowd's whispers. You're done. A sharp breath hitched in his throat, but no words came out. His hands, still clenched into fists, trembled slightly. His mind was racing, looking for an escape, but there wasn't one. The silence stretched. Everyone was watching. Then the chief took a slow, deliberate step forward. Sergeant Callahan, as of this moment, you are suspended from duty, effective immediately. The weight of those words crushed him. A sharp inhale from Briggs confirmed it. This wasn't just temporary. Callahan's fingers twitched at his belt, hovering over the badge that had once given him power. Now it felt like a heavy chain around his neck. Hand it over. His head snapped up. Sir, please. The chief didn't blink. Badge. Gun. Now. Callahan swallowed hard. With slow, shaky hands, he reached for his badge, his grip tightening around the metal as if he could somehow take it all back. He unhooked it, staring at it for a long second. Then, with an air of finality, he placed it in the chief's outstretched hand. Next, his fingers hovered over his gun, his last shred of authority. Another deep breath. He unclipped the holster, pulled the weapon free, and let it go. The chief didn't even look at him. He simply turned to Briggs. Escort him out. Briggs hesitated, then nodded. Come on, man. Callahan's teeth clenched. His entire body locked up. This isn't over. His voice was low, shaking with barely contained rage. Shaq laughed softly. Not loud, not mocking, just a knowing chuckle. Oh, buddy, it's so over, Callahan snapped. His eyes flashed with fury as he whipped around, storming toward the exit. But just as he reached the doors, the press swarmed. Cameras flashed. Microphones shot forward. Sergeant Callahan, do you have a statement? Why did you detain a doctor who works here? Are you aware the footage has already gone viral? The reporters' voices overlapped, relentless. Callahan's breath quickened. For the first time in his life, he was the one being interrogated. No badge, no authority, no escape. Shaq turned back to Marcus. You good, Doc? Marcus exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Yeah, but his voice was tight, his body still wired with tension. Shaq studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket, pulling out a small business card. He handed it to Marcus. Marcus frowned, flipping it over. A number was printed on the front. No name, just digits. He looked up, confused. What's this? Shaq smiled. A new opportunity. Marcus's eyebrows lifted, but before he could ask, Shaq simply patted his shoulder. Call it tomorrow, trust me. Marcus turned the card over again, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it was big. Shaq hands Marcus something unexpected. A phone number. Marcus sat in his car, gripping the small business card like it held the secrets of the universe. The numbers printed on it stared back at him, crisp and bold, a single call away from something life-changing. He exhaled, still processing everything that had happened. Just hours ago, he had been manhandled outside his own hospital. Just hours ago, he had been humiliated, treated like a criminal. And now he was staring at a phone number that Shaq had personally handed him, telling him, call it tomorrow. Trust me. Marcus had no idea what waited on the other side of that call. But he knew one thing for certain. Shaquille O'Neal didn't make small moves. The next morning, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, coffee untouched, staring at his phone. His fingers hovered over the dial pad. A part of him hesitated. Was this real? Was he about to call some random number and embarrass himself? He shook his head, inhaled deeply, and dialed. The phone rang. Once. Twice. Then, a voice answered. This is Dr. Louis Chambers, Chief of Surgery at Lenox Memorial. Who am I speaking with? Marcus's breath caught in his throat. Lenox Memorial, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country. His heart pounded. Why was he speaking to the Chief of Surgery there? Marcus cleared his throat, forcing himself to sound composed. Doctor Marcus Evans. I was told to call this number. A pause, then a chuckle. Shaq told me you'd be reaching out. Marcus's eyes widened. Shaq set this up? Dr. Chambers continued, his tone professional but warm. I've already gone through your credentials. Your reputation precedes you, Dr. Evans. We're currently looking for a new lead surgeon. I'd love to set up a meeting to discuss bringing you on board. Marcus felt his entire body go still. Lead surgeon? This was more than an opportunity. This was a dream. He had spent years grinding, sacrificing sleep, missing family events, putting everything into his work. And now the door to one of the biggest hospitals in the country was wide open because of Shaq. Marcus swallowed hard, gripping the phone. I don't know what to say. Dr. Chambers chuckled. Say you'll come in tomorrow at 9. Marcus exhaled sharply. I'll be there. That evening, Marcus met Shaq outside the hospital. He didn't say anything at first, just stared at the man who had completely changed his life. Finally, he extended his hand. I don't know how to thank you. Shaq just grinned. Then don't. Just make the most of it. Marcus gripped his hand firmly, because he knew he would. Marcus shakes Shaq's hand, saying, I don't know how to thank you. The world had moved on, but not for Callahan. Weeks had passed since that disastrous night at the hospital, but the damage was permanent. His name had been dragged through every headline, every news cycle, every social media post. Disgraced officer Callahan fired amidst racial profiling scandal. Former cop faces backlash after wrongful detainment of black doctor. Justice served, Callahan out, Dr. Evans promoted. Callahan couldn't leave his house without feeling the weight of 1,000 eyes. Strangers whispered when he walked by. His neighbors barely acknowledged him. His entire career, gone. His pension, in question. His future, non-existent. The department had made an example out of him. The chief gave 0 chances for redemption. No reinstatement, no appeals. Just a swift and brutal end. And worst of all, while his life spiraled, Marcus Evans was skyrocketing. Inside a high-end newsroom, a polished anchorwoman flashed a bright smile at the camera. In other news, Dr. Marcus Evans has officially been named the new head of surgery at Lenox Memorial Hospital. Shaq sat back in his chair, grinning. The TV screen displayed footage of Marcus in a sleek new white coat, shaking hands with the hospital board. Cameras flashed, journalists scrambled to ask questions. He looked like he belonged, because he did. Dr. Evans' promotion comes just weeks after a racial profiling incident went viral, where he was wrongfully detained by former Sergeant Callahan. The public outcry led to swift consequences, ending Callahan's career and sparking discussions on racial bias in law enforcement. Shaq shook his head, chuckling to himself. The irony was too perfect. Callahan had tried to tear Marcus down. Instead, he had put him on the map. Shaq reached for his phone and scrolled through Twitter, where the story was still trending. A poetic ending. Yar, justice for Drivens. Callahan thought he was powerful. Look at him now. This is what happens when you mess with the wrong doctor. Shaq smirked and turned off the TV. He leaned back, arms crossed, and let out a final laugh. That's what happens when you mess with the wrong doctor. Shaq shakes his head and says, that's what happens when you mess with the wrong doctor.